to the 12th of the presentations in Hermetic America, and we're nearing the midpoint, the pivotal point. The pivotal point for Hermetic America is the dawning of the 20th century, where the pivot had been constantly rotating to free the new world, the new vision of man from the past. At the beginning of the 20th century, the pivot changed and sought to affinitize the new world, the United States, to the future. It was a different emphasis, and the past and the future are rather like the forces of electricity and magnetism. They go together. And just as James Clerk Maxwell in 1873 was able to publish the theory of electromagnetism, the treatise on electromagnetism, my work has been able to establish the theory of the future and the new past, of them being a set together, and that they have a watershed in the emphasis between them. Electricity is polarized and tends to have an integral quality to it, whereas magnetism has a spread differential quality to it. And the future is like the magnetic spectrum, and the past is like the electric spectrum. One of the emphases for us is that time has forms, and the forms of time have a duration. They have a beginning, they have a development, they have a maturity, they have an old age, and they have an end. There is such a thing as an end of time. And there is also such a thing as the beginning of a new time form. And for some long while, the metaphysical, the occult, the popular phraseology is the New Age. Even on the American dollar bill, you find the Latin phrase that means a new order of the ages, used 300 years ago, with the pyramid, with the eye at the top of the pyramid. All of this is Hermetic America. It's on the money. You can read it if you can read the symbols. But reading the symbols will just give you the past, will not illumine the future. One has to be able to look through the all-seeing eye to see the field of vision, which is actually the field of differential conscious visioning. And this acts as a quintessential dimension to the way in which the integral order of the ages before held its value, its significance, and the future, largely in a vision, is initially unknown unless one has the gift of prophecy, or unless one has a poetic ability to prism through your spirit person as a form the future as developing out of a new understanding of the past and to present this. One of the difficulties for us as a legacy of the last 300 years in the United States, more than any other area of the world, is the increasing awareness and problem of having been misled by false understandings, false mental orders of the past and of ourselves. And a great deal of the revolutionary era in which the United States was born, and the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution, and the Transcendental Revolutions, the Age of Revolutions, was to escape from, in any way that one could, from the confines of a false world, a false humanity, the false institutions, the false personalities, the false expectations on every level. And by the beginning of the 19th century, the United States was taking the lead in persons exempting themselves from the comforts and from the certainties of a social order, of a family order, and becoming literally outlaws. The quality that comes out of this, that is central to all of this, is a new understanding of the Bible. And the United States took a great lead in the 19th century and the early 20th century to encourage a new reading of the Bible, a new understanding, especially of Jesus. And we're looking at today the way in which the trigger for that was the rediscovery of Egypt. Napoleon's forces that went en masse to Egypt included a great complement of French savants of all kinds, and they were organized by one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, Fourier, for whom the Fourier series is named, and he later was in charge of publishing in 20 great elephant folio volumes the description of Egypt, the culmination of Napoleon's en force to recapture the origins, the new origins of civilization. Not so much Rome, not so much Greece, but further back to Egypt. And it is the development of Egyptian archaeology in the 19th century that is the driving wheel for a new scalar of civilization, one that would be revolutionary. And the first really comprehensive great new history of Egypt was by James Henry Breasted. The history of Egypt, when it first came out, was compared to Mommsen's History of Rome or Prescott's Conquest of Mexico, one of the world's great histories. And we'll talk next week more about the relationship of James Henry Breasted and his work. It eventually led to an understanding of how to read hieroglyphics. And by reading hieroglyphics, the ancient Egyptian wisdom came back to life and paired with archaeology that was heavily funded by American patrons. That development of archaeology began to pair up what they had found by the spade, what they had translated in the study, and what was suspect now in the pulpit. One of the outcomes in the 20th century, in the second half of it, was the development of the Anchor Bible, which is now nearly 60 volumes in translations of the books of the Bible, but is also filled with dozens and dozens of volumes of extra studies. And the two great major editors of the Anchor Bible were William Foxwell Albright and David Noel Friedman, two Americans. And the Anchor Bible is a fresh approach to the world's greatest classic. Its object is to make the Bible accessible to the modern reader. Its method is to arrive at the meaning of biblical literature through exact translation and extended exposition, and to reconstruct the ancient setting of the biblical story, as well as the circumstances of its transcription and characteristics of its transcribers. Two figures emerge, one from the beginnings of the Old Testament and one from the beginnings of the New Testament, Abraham and Jesus. The historical time form between the two of them is almost precisely 2,000 years, which constitutes in the ancient Hermetic wisdom as being an aeon. And the more that there were translations and archaeological discoveries and new commentaries, the more it was found that the ancient Egyptian roots deeply complemented the Semitic roots that came originally from Mesopotamia. Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldees, southern Iraq, what is today Iraq. Chaldea was the ancient place that we now understand as being the original home of Sumerians, who had come into the region and who had begun making civilization even before the ancient Egyptians consolidated their first dynasty. The first dynasty is about 3000 BC. The Sumerians began having leagues of city-states by about 3500 BC, but the formative initial period was about 4000 BC, and this is exactly 2,000 years before Abraham. And this is the signaling beginning point that is always marked as the development of Adam and Eve. From Adam and Eve to Abraham is about 2,000 years. From Abraham to Jesus, about 2,000 years. And so it became increasingly understandable for those who understood Hermetic wisdom patterns, time forms, that Abraham was a fulcrum between Adam and Jesus, between the first man in a special way, not the first man made out of the earth, but the first man from the earth who was breathed into by a divine pneuma, a divine spirit. God breathed into Adam's nostrils, and he woke up. He awakened from a previous state into a remarkably transformed state and became the first person in that transformed state. And the context of that state was Eden, a paradise. And the fall out of that paradise by the temptation, proverbially, of the apple from the serpent. The apple from the tree, the serpent on the tree. And one has to understand deeply here that the serpent wound around a tree or a branch of a tree that now becomes a staff is the ancient Hermetic symbol of medicine. The god of medicine, hermetically, was Asclepios. And Asclepios was a contemporary with Moses, who wrote the description of the Garden of Eden story of Adam and Eve, who wrote the patriarchy of the lineages generation by generation from Abraham to Joseph, who became literally the master of Egypt. And with that, Genesis, in its 50 chapters, has its beginnings, taking from Adam through Abraham and 4 generations, and leaving off that a patriarchal Jew had become the grand wisdom director of all of Egypt. This was Moses' way of saying, when we look at the past in this way, we need to understand that our fall was by a tradition that was different from the one in which we are endorsing. And the difficulty for that was that Asclepios, being a contemporary of Moses about 1250 BC, is in fact predated by almost 1600 years before him. And the original god of medicine was Imhotep, who was the wisdom master for one of the greatest pharaohs of the 3rd dynasty, the Old Kingdom, King Djoser. And Djoser is the first one to actually have a pyramid built for him, the step pyramid, in a number of levels, 7 levels, where the old mastaba tombs of the 1st and 2nd dynasty were put one on top of another so that you had a step pyramid. And the architect for that was Imhotep, and then found the mathematics of how to make a true pyramid. And the red pyramid at Saqqara is the world's first true pyramid, also designed by Imhotep, so that medicine and architecture were 2 aspects of this man who became the god of wisdom, who later on became the Hermetic figure of Asclepios, and whose symbol is the serpent wound around the tree, the branch of the tree. It was a cypress branch that was cut because those branches grow straight up. It is this quality of Imhotep, Asclepius, that in the ancient Hermetic wisdom goes even further back to the god of wisdom, whose name was Thoth. And Thoth had been misunderstood in the 19th century as being an adjunct to the Osirian myth, to the Isis myth of rebirth, of resurrection. Whereas we know by the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, that they are different traditions, and that Thoth is older than Osiris. That the discovery of writing, the ability to write symbols, goes back more than 5,000 years. That those hieroglyphs are already polished by the beginnings of the Old Kingdom, 3000 BC, as is the mythology surrounding Osiris, and that the origins of this go back much farther than just another 1,000 years. They go back, in fact, almost 30-some thousand years. That the Paleolithic wisdom tradition was always to put symbolic images together in an order, so that one moving through the cave was exposed to the progression of images, of symbols, so that they would then occur to you not as in a line, but as in a displacement of the images, because the concourse was always in utter darkness, and the source of light were the little clay oil lamps, hand-sized bits of clay, hollowed out so that oil or pitch could be placed in them, and you would light that through a hole at the top, and it would burn, and that was the source of the light. So that literally the hand carried the light, and the other hand carried the ability to seal the images, so that one finds in Paleolithic art the Paleolithic hand, which is the seal that these symbols in this displacing order, as the light would come to them and then move on, and the symbols and images would go back into the darkness, and the next ones would be presented, so that you had like a moving picture. But in Paleolithic mentality, which was just freshly Homo sapiens sapien, wise about being wise, you had the presentation in what to us today would be painstaking slow motion. It would take quite a long while for Paleolithic initiates to be able to take in the significance of what it was they were not only seeing but being exposed to. Because what would come out of them was feeling tones associated with those images, knit together by an unfamiliar language. And it took a while for that to be able not just to sink in, but to seep through the entire mythic horizon of experience. You could not do it all at once. It might take a repetition, and in fact we can see that from the earliest cave sanctuaries that have an illuminated series of symbols and images knit together in a network, in a pattern of pilgrimages that from Cosquer to Lascaux is about 12 or 13,000 years. And there is very little improvement, except that Lascaux is one of the great highlights of the entirety of that tradition. And from Lascaux to Niao, which is about 7,000 years more, there is hardly any improvement over at Lascaux, so that for about 20-some thousand years, there was not much change except for the spectacular occurrence of a world treasure like Lascaux. What this did was make the wisdom tradition of handling the sequencing of symbols not so much a linearity, but a morphing by a fresh emergence, and then allowing it to subside back into the darkened context. But one could revisit this, re-pilgrimage this, and over a lifetime, Paleolithic man probably had a lifetime of not much more than 45 years on an average. It took a long time to acclimate to being able to remember what one had seen, what one had kinesthetically done, what feeling tones and images survived, held together by not just the thread of the language. We're used to thinking of discourse as like an argument that is made in a thread of discourse. It is the net. It is the net of mythos. And so one of the earliest ascriptions to Thoth is that he is the one who is able to bring the net into the place of the flame. He is the one who is able to make the matrix, as we would say, the morphing pattern, coherent, not as a singular integral, but as a differential splay of the display in all of its affective and effective qualities. And out of this was slowly tutored the ability to remember an extra supranatural dimension to life. Before this, there were moments where there would be indications that there is something beyond, but there was never a visionary memory of a dimension of the supernatural. And so what comes out of this is finally the sense that there is not only a netherworld and an overworld, but they together constitute an other world, which is here in this world. It is the extra dimensions of this world that is presenced by an other world. All of this comes into play in the time of Jesus in a very spectacular way, for those who followed the Jesus in Alexandria and Mary Magdalene series. Jesus' ability to illumine a new extension of that net so that the other world is the predominant future understanding of valuation, of calibration, of the way in which the scalar is made, not by lines of language and not just by nets of language, but by the resonant grouping together into a set, and that this grouping into a set became a new cosmos, a new harmonic. That particular harmonic goes back into a quality that was there in Alexandria for at least 300 years before the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. It is only late in the 20th century and the beginnings of the 21st century that we can understand that the Hermetic quality of Thoth, even though it went back to Paleolithic cave times of 35,000 BC, had morphed in a great transformative way about 3000 BC and again about 500 BC, and that the time forms that came out of this are calibrated for us at the very beginnings of what is today the New Testament. If we open up the Gospel of Matthew, right away we are presented with the lineage, the generations of Jesus. And Matthew portrays the generations from Abraham to David being 14 generations, and they extend about 1,000 years. The next 1,000 years is portioned at double the rapidity. There are 28 generations between David and Jesus. Not just David and Jesus, but David and Jesus the Christ. Because if you count the generations, There are 14 from Abraham to David. There are 14 from David to the coming home from the exile, which happened about 500 BC. And then there are 14 generations. And if you count them, there are only 12, and Jesus becomes the 13th, so that the Christ becomes the 14th. That first 1,000 years is the original understanding at that time of a millennium. And the portioning of the next millennium into two 500-year periods, at that time, it was called a cycle of the phoenix, as we have talked about in the previous series. So that you have the beginnings of a geometricity of time forms. This 1,000 years also can be expressed in two 500-year periods, and that 2,000-year period at the time, in Jesus' time, was called an aeon. And that particular aeon from Abraham to Jesus, that 2,000 years, is the second part of a double aeon going back to Adam. And in this way, a time-form calibration was made apparent in a new kind of a visionary geometry. When we're looking at Hermetic America, we're able to look back through the last 2,000 years and to understand it as a time form as well. And for us, looking back 500 years, we look back to the Renaissance, the Hermetic Renaissance in northern Italy, especially Florence, Venice, the area around Milano, somewhat in Rome, but centered largely in Florence. The great Florentine academy set up by Cosimo de' Medici and really brought to its apex by Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo il Magnifico, is about 500 years before our time. If we look back a millennium, we look back to the beginnings of what turned out to be the social ethos that developed the Crusades. And if we look back to the time of Jesus, a full aeon, we can see a sequence of an aeonic threshold, one coming to an end and a new one beginning, of a millennial threshold coming to an end and a new one having a beginning, and a cycle of the phoenix also coming to an end and having a beginning. What is difficult to appreciate and understand that this is always a pair of time forms interchanging. And if you look at the way in which the ancient Hermetic tradition had understood it, about 300 years before one of the time form cycles begins to have its form, there is a second aeonic millennial year of the phoenix time form, and it's usually running about 350 years before. Before Jesus, that previous signal for that other time form was Alexander the Great and the founding of Alexandria itself, the city. So that the city of Alexandria became the extended harmonic of Alexander the Great himself and carried that entire tradition along with the development of the city. For our time period, 300 years before us, comes Benjamin Franklin. And when we look at the esoteric quality of Franklin, we can understand that it is carrying all the way through to today. It is very difficult for those who have not followed this to be able to understand we're looking at a way to expand intelligence into having other dimensions. And just as there are 4 dimensions in space-time, there are 4 dimensions in the expanded the Hermetic wisdom, superspace, supertime. One of the figures that dominated the old nemesis to the previous aeon was the construct of astrology. Astrology developing in Neo-Babylonia and extending itself increasingly so that the accuracy of horoscope predictions was no longer on the basis of differential conscious vision, but on the plotting of just the integral values and meanings. And increasingly the Roman emperors became subject to astrological superstition, and it came to an apex in Jesus' time with the Emperor Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius Caesar ran his entire life and the structure of the Roman Empire by astrological predictions. The first really great astrological book to survive from that entire period is translated in the Loeb Classical Library, Manilius. Jesus comes out of a tradition that is older than astrology and exceeds it. And when we come back from the break, we're going to take a look at the way in which astrology limited itself to 7 spheres: the sun, the moon first, and then the sun, the 5 planets that are stars, and those 7 were called the Hymarmene. And in the 8th was the fixed stars that are beyond the moving planetary stars, beyond the moving of the sun, beyond the moving of the moon. In the early 20th century, as we have talked about, one of the first great visionaries to understand in a Hermetic American way that there was a different perspective on the heavens was the great astronomer Percival Lowell, who founded the Lowell Observatory, as we talked about last week, in Flagstaff, Arizona. One of the first follow-ups to that was H.G. Wells with War of the Worlds. Lowell had said, there are canals on Mars. It's a sign of intelligent life. The British Honorable Hermetic American H.G. Wells in War of the Worlds said, perhaps they're plotting our own doom. And within 15 years, you had another Hermetic American view of it, that by Edgar Rice Burroughs, Under the Moons of Mars, published in 1912. War of the Worlds is 1898, and Under the Moons of Mars gives an American adventurer, a Virginia fighting man who had fought in the Civil War and had fought against Indians in Arizona, and suddenly is in a cave, and something behind him in the cave frightens the Indians who are coming in to kill him, and they run, and he is unable to turn himself to see what in this primordial cave would so frighten them that they would run away. And he realizes that something snaps, and his supernatural person is freed from his body, and he sees his body laying there. And when he steps out of the cave, the red star Mars beckons to him and pulls him to Mars. And the development by 1912 was that there is a secret release of the wisdom spirit of men and women that can literally transpose us out of this planet, out of this world, out of this astrological place. And increasingly through the 20th century, Hermetic America will explore, as we will see, the deepening sense that this is something that can be done not metaphysically, but scientifically. This is something that requires, though, a new kind of personality, a personality that was once rare in the world, was a special initiated wisdom person, but ways need to be found now to spread that out so that there are tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people for whom this is a normal, expanded way of living. And by the early 21st century, it's apparent now that very few people are able to hear without a preparation of someone who talks in this way. Those who have been here for a while realize people come in, bounce off, because what they are carrying with them is their own sphere. And this is one of the great problems of wisdom traditions. Let's take a little break and we'll come back. One of the sets of hieroglyphic characters that describes Thoth is the tongue of the balance. It's a double entendre. It's the tongue being able to speak, but in a weighing of the balance, the tongue is the fulcrum where what is being balanced can be made to be very even. It's a pinpoint balance. The ancient Egyptian origin of Hermetic language was that Thoth is able then to record the balance, but also able to speak and teach the language, the phrases, the spells, as they're sometimes called, the poetic sections of the kind of language that will prepare you so that if you are able to go through those sets of sayings in the order of your pilgrimage, not just the pilgrimage through the nether world, through the night world, but through your lifetime, if you have had the balance of the tongue in your lifetime, then when it comes to a final judgment, the Greek word for it was a psychostasia, the weighing of your heart against an ostrich plume, which was the hieroglyphic for Ma'at, M-A-A-T. Ma'at is the goddess of justice. But there was another goddess involved because the ancient Hermetic tradition was always looking at pairs. Whatever can be put into play in an integral, natural way comes out paired, so that there is an ability to have a tuning of the pairs, which is where the archetype of the balance would be. And one of the other goddesses was named Nephthys, who was the sister of Isis and always accompanies Isis in that feminine pairing. But Nephthys also is known by the hieroglyphs that translate as Seshat, meaning the writer, the woman who knows how to write, but she does not write in words. She is the patroness of architects. So that Nephthys While Isis is the patroness of the way to recollect and rebirth, remember the body, Nephthys is able to remember the structure of the architectural elements of life into the great art of the temples, into the great art of the pyramids, into the great art of the cities. And so it is this quality in the Hermetic tradition that especially comes through in early Hermetic America. And the first figure who really exemplifies these is Thomas Jefferson, as we've talked about, who is a great architect. We remember him for Monticello, for the University of Virginia, for several structures in Richmond, the State House there, but also being able to write, being able, just the Declaration of Independence, the many of the other archetypal documents of the American contribution to civilization. But that tongue of the balance becomes especially poignant in the development of Hermetic America later in the 19th century and into the 20th century. And one of the figures who prominently figures in that is Albert Abraham Michelson, A.A. Michelson, who's forever famous for having been able to compute the speed of light accurately, but is also famous for being able to design instruments to do so. And one of the instruments was the ability to have a revolving mirror balanced to another mirror that was put on a tuning fork, so that the vibration of the mirror on the tuning fork, if perfectly balanced, would have the perfect reflection of an introduced image or source of light. They would be perfectly balanced, and the tuning vibration would be able then to put the image slightly out of balance, so that if you rotated the second mirror fast enough, he used about 125, 130 times per second, up to 200 times per second, you would be able to reestablish the focus of the balance. And it is the tongue of the balance of the two little pinpoint metal holders to keep the revolving mirror so that it was effortless in its motion. And it was this kind of differential interferometer, later on to become just called an interferometer, that enabled him to perfect the calibration of the speed of light. He did this in the late 1870s and completed it in great refinement by 1887, and laid the foundation for a number of expansions in science. One of the great beneficiaries, of course, was Albert Einstein, who depended, in all of the developments of 20th century physics are posited not only because of Michelson being able to make the instrumentation, which has a definite hermetic resonance and quality to it, but to apply this also then to the measurement of whether there was the issue in the late 19th century, is there an ether drift? The ancient idea being that light must travel in some kind of an ether, spelled originally with an A-E-T-H-E-R. And almost all physics at the time was based on an understanding that there must be a mysterious ether through which light will travel, through which then later, when it became apparent that the carrier of light, Einstein by 1923 understood the photon as the carrier of electromagnetic energy. But had Michelson not proven that there is no ether, there is an action at a distance, and there's not some kind of a medium. And of course, in our time, the medium has been, the ether has been reinstated as space itself. Michelson is that kind of Hermetic American who originally was an immigrant at age 3. His parents were very poor immigrants, and they ran a little shop finally in Virginia City, Nevada, so that he grew up in the Western mining camp ethos, but because of his great talents was sent to the Naval Academy at Annapolis, where eventually he became the outstanding scientist in that particular venue, and was then promoted to Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, and finally brought into the mainstream. We'll talk more about that next week. But there was no chance of doing science on the graduate level in the United States at that time. This is the 1870s, 1880s. There was no way to do graduate work, so that you had to go to Europe for your graduate work. So he went to Berlin and studied under von Helmholtz for a year in order to get himself raised up on a graduate level of science and math and so forth. And it was there in Europe, in Berlin, and then doing a little vacation work before coming back to the US in Paris, that he began to become quite famous. As long as he would have stayed in the United States, he would have been heard at maybe third hand. But being in Berlin at the great physics and math center at the time, he went from Berlin for a couple of months down to Heidelberg. And so he became well known to the European scientific and mathematical community. It was in response to that he received funding from Alexander Graham Bell, who had made a great deal of money, had been a poor man himself initially, and so he put up a couple of $1,000s to buy equipment for Michelson to do his experiments, to refine his way of working, which was really extraordinary at the time. He was able to hand design and have built for him the various components for his instrumentation to register 1 part in 100 million parts of differentiation in terms of vibration and energy frequencies. Unheard of for the day. But one of the outcomes of that was the realization in the United States that there needed to be graduate schools where science and math could be explored, and the first one to be established was Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Specifically in Baltimore because Annapolis is not very far from Baltimore, and they were painfully aware that a genius on the level of Michelson had to go to Europe in order to get his graduate work, and so they founded Johns Hopkins University specifically to be a place where you could do graduate work in the sciences and in math And it also was the trigger for the beginnings and the foundings, finally in 1892, of the University of Chicago. So that schools like Johns Hopkins and the University of Chicago, and then the transforms of places like Princeton and Harvard and University of California, at Berkeley especially, and all of the later development of the greatness of science and math in the United States came out of this era, out of this time. When we look at Michelson being born in 1852, it's difficult for us to imagine the state of the United States at that time. We had become the most international, global country in the world, almost on the same level as the British Empire. But where the British Empire was set up as an empire, it was the American commercial and industrial networks that were foremost. And one of the qualities that comes out is about the time Michelson was born, Moby Dick was being published, Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And already one finds at the very beginnings of Moby Dick, as Ishmael goes into the inn, the Spouter Inn, this whole bunch of mariners come stomping in, and the owner says, well, this is the crew from such and such a boat. They've been out on the oceans of the world for 4 years, and they've just now got back into port, so the first place they come to is here to take part in the grog, the jovial camaraderie between such kinds of men, and bringing the news. And he says, at last we will get news of the Fijis. And in chapter 14, Nantucket, there's just a few sentences that Melville conveys the tone of Hermetic America by 1850. Look at the wondrous traditional story of how this island was settled by the red men. Thus goes the legend. In olden times, an eagle swooped down on the New England coast, carried off an infant Indian in his talons. With loud lament, the parents saw their child born. Out of sight over the wide waters, they resolved to follow in the same direction, and setting out in their canoes after a perilous passage, they discovered the island. And there they found an empty ivory casket, the poor little Indian's skeleton. And of course, later on, at the very end of Moby Dick, Ishmael is saved by the casket of Queequeg. That is the only thing left afloat after Moby Dick has sunk the Pequod and drowned everyone. It is only Ishmael floating on this coffin that had been specially pitch-caked so that it would be airtight. And it was like a pontoon that saved him, that casket. So in a way, Melville's Ishmael becomes a new kind of American. The primordial little red man has become a planetary man. And he says, and thus have these naked Nantucketers, these sea hermits, issuing from their anthill in the sea, overrun and conquered the watery world, like so many Alexanders, parceling out among them the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans as the three pirate powers did Poland. Let America add Mexico to Texas and pile Cuba upon Canada. Let the English overswarm all India and hang out their blazing banner from the sun. 2/3 of this terraceous globe are Nantuckets. For the sea is his, he owns it as emperors own empires. Other seamen have but a right of way through it. Merchant ships are but extension bridges, armed ones, but floating forts, even pirates and privateers, though following the sea as highwaymen the road, but plunder other ships, other fragments of the land like themselves, without seeking to draw their living from the bottomless deep itself. The Nantucketer, he alone, resides and rests on the sea. He alone, in Bible language, goes down to it in ships, to and fro, plowing it as his own special plantation. And his final sentence, the Nantucketer, out of sight of land, furls his sail and lays him to his rest, while under his very pillow rush herds of walruses and whales. That there was a quality of coming at home in the entirety of the world, so that all of the oceans of the world were but a parceled out place for American whaling ships. And of course, this was a very small group of people. New Bedford and Nantucket together, even with all the women and children and those that stayed at home, did not exceed several thousand people. Exactly at the same time was the burgeoning opening of the entire West. And for the United States, for Hermetic America, we have to understand it isn't just the opening of the West to California and to Oregon, but it's opening of the West, leaping over the Pacific Ocean all the way to Japan and China, because it's 1858 that Commodore Perry forced Shogunate Japan to open its doors that had been sealed for over 300 years. It's only a generation after that that Percival Lowell, for instance, goes to Japan, learns Japanese, and is so revered as a knowing diplomat and negotiator that he's hired by the new nation of Korea to be their ambassador to the United States to make business deals. And so you find that Americans become not an empire like the British Empire or a en française spread of French influence, but America takes in all of these qualities from all over the world and incorporates them in her sphere of transform. So that here, as we talked about a little bit last week, Percival Lowell's sister, Amy Lowell, translating with her longtime partner, Florence, who went under the name Florence Asco, poems from the Chinese. Her translation by Tu Fu, and the title is At the Edge of Heaven, Thinking of Li Po. Tu Fu and Li Po had been two of the great poets of all time under the Tang rule of Meng Huang, Meng the Brilliant, and then his dynasty had suffered one of the greatest tragedies in world history. He became enamored of Yang Kuai-fei, a beautiful Cleopatra-like courtesan, and had ignored the power structure that it took to keep a dynasty alive. And one of the most powerful generals of the time, An Luzhen, made a palace coup and initiated a rebellion that eventually spread throughout Tang China. And the population of Tang China at the time was about 51 million. Within a couple of years of that An Luan rebellion, more than a third of Chinese were killed, more than 17 million. And so it became one of the great tragedies. And in this, Tu Fu and Li Po were singled out as those kinds of persons who allowed for this effete development, and they were exiled to opposite ends of China. Tu Fu was exiled to the far north, what is today Manchuria, and Li Po to the far south, what is today Yunnan near Vietnam. So here's Tu Fu at the edge of heaven in the northern part of the globe, thinking of Li Po. Amy Lowell translates, "A cold wind blows up from the edge of heaven. The state of mind of the superior man is what? When does the wild goose arrive? Autumn water flows high in the rivers and lakes. They hated your essay, yet your fate was to succeed. The demons where you are rejoice to see men go by. You should hold speech with the soul of Yuan and toss a poem into the Milo River as a gift to him." All of this transpiring at a time when, after the Civil War, after the assassination of Lincoln, after the absolute abject difficulty of Johnson to carry out Lincoln's second term, the two administrations of U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, gave a new kind of spirit to the industrial power of the United States. That in the Civil War, the United States had developed a military that was industrialized for the first time in the world. It was as if the Roman legions had become mechanized. It was the power of American firepower in the Civil War that ended up with so many casualties. There were almost as many men killed in the Civil War in the United States as Americans were killed in World War II, more than 1 million killed, and many more, hundreds of thousands, maimed and injured. It was to use that Yankee industrial power and military prowess that ended up in the United States, finally, by the end of the 19th century, beginning to challenge empires in the world. And of course, it's the Spanish Empire that was first challenged by them. We took over the Philippines from the Spanish. We took over Cuba. We took over a great deal and had already forced Mexico in the late 1840s to pay attention to us, to understand that American power is an industrial juggernaut that has a military that is able now to expand itself. And the imitators of that American industrial complex after the Civil War up until the beginnings of the 20th century that had imitators in Japan and in Germany. The direct outcome of that would be the confrontation in the Second World War, the two prongs of that. And the outcome of the Second World War would be the super expansion of that military industrial complex to unheard of heights that we today are used to hearing us characterized as the only superpower left on the planet. It is not so much an empire, it is that the planet is ours. But the Hermetic America understanding, it is not the planet that is ours, it is the fact that the Earth is seen as a planet. And here, this volume, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1954, it's entitled The Earth as a Planet. And it's in a series of 4 volumes about the solar system. And the author The main editor, the person in charge of this, is another immigrant, Hermetic America, Gerard Kuiper. Kuiper, as a Dutchman, had come to the University of Chicago and had thrived, like so many other American immigrants, had understood that here was a potential to open up new visions, new ideas, and to get the economic background, to have the industrial might to put it into practice, not only to theorize about physics and chemistry and astronomy, but to put it into order. And what was holding those two aspects together, theory and practice, was a star philosophy bridging the two. And one of the great issues now in the early 21st century, it's called translational science. How can you quicken the time between pure research and its application into products? How can you close the gap between a theoretical physics and a practical physics that can be put into an economic dispersal? How can research in basic biochemistry and genetics be translated into drugs? It is this relationality that changed dramatically, especially in the United States. Europe, the patronage was always largely royal, or by some individuals who then wanted to expand their economic empire. But when you had that kind of private, non-royal patronizing, especially for Europeans, they moved to the United States. A case in point is Andrew Carnegie. He's an immigrant Hermetic American. And as soon as he arrived, he began putting his money, his funding to work to make institutes, to make gifts of libraries, to make technological instruments, and as we will see next week and take another look, the building of Mount Wilson and Mount Palomar observatories. They're the Carnegie Foundation. The Carnegie Foundation in Washington, D.C. is one of the great homes for research and application in the world. The Earth as a planet belonging to a solar system, belonging to a star system. And that was 1954, and less than 2 generations later, you have things like the Encyclopedia of the Solar System. And going out of date almost annually now, more than 1,000 pages, so that the publications come out every month at about 400 pages. This is Icarus, the International Journal of Solar System Studies. It's international provisionally, but when you look at the funding of it, Cornell University, California Institute of Technology, the University of Michigan, Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory, Lowell Observatory, Mars Hill, Flagstaff, and it goes on and on. It is Hermetic American understanding every month. This means that there are more than 6,000 pages a year just to cover the applications of the development of a new civilization that only I seem to have named so far, the stellar civilization. It is the expansion to a new harmonic of a quality of transformed person who is able to work with others on the scale of hundreds of thousands, if not millions. Instead of there being a community, which is rare when it has more than several hundred people, as most utopian communities throughout history were, they were limited to that. Now we have communities where Nature magazine may be read by several million people in the United States just by itself. This is a different scale. So that when you have Mars coming into play, you no longer have the War of the Worlds or just Edgar Rice Burroughs under the moons of Mars, but you begin to have something like this that came out in 1950, The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. This is a copy that he signed for me 40 years ago. The World Science Fiction Convention was in the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley in 1968, and Ray was late getting there. He came about midnight, and everybody had gone home except maybe 8 or 9 of us. And he was so glad to see us, and he signed my copy of the Martian Chronicles. And he brought in a radio play called Leviathan 99. He did the screenplay of Moby Dick for John Huston, for which Huston, being a tough guy, transported Bradbury to Ireland and would not let him leave the estate until he finished the screenplay. And so Bradbury got full of Hermetic America images from Moby Dick, but in a science fiction way. And he tried to write a science fiction Moby Dick, and he called it Leviathan 99, about a starship commander in the far future pursuing this demonic kind of whirlpool galactic demon, and all hands perish save I who are alone have come to tell you. So he played the radio play for us because there was no network in the United States that could do a radio play by 1968. So it was done in Europe. And we were the first people in the United States to hear that radio play. I'm going to talk next week more about the quality of how American science fiction, especially just before the First World War, began to have a vision, like a prophetic vision of times to come, things to come. And someone following it very close was H.G. Wells. It was like a Hermetic American honorary. His most powerful book was called Things to Come, about a future after a Holocaust, of a group of planetary people coming back together to bring life into a new vision. But at the same time that they were starting to make a film on Things to Come with Raymond Massey, he put out another volume that predicted the development of the atomic bomb. And I'll bring those next week when we begin to talk about the way in which the future of Hermetic America is now translating so that it is a planetary culture and it is an interplanetary civilization in the making. More next week.